Hi, I'm Annie Fitzsimmons. I'm your Washington Realtors Legal Hotline lawyer, and this is another episode in our series entitled Thriving Through an Audit. And thriving through an audit requires actions by brokers licensed to the firm long before the auditor ever walks through the door. And that's what we're talking about today. An issue that, who are you two people? This is Bill Dutra and Cathy McDonald. Quick introductions of yourselves.
My name is Bill Dutra. I work with the Department of Licensing and our Business and Professions Division. One of the many things that I do is work with 38 different licensing programs and get to meet and work with our licensing partners like Washington Realtors.
How many years have you been doing this, Bill?
Just over 30 years. The majority of that with the real estate programs.
Yeah, every law rewrite that we've done as an association working with the Department of Licensing, Bill has been involved in that process. So
I think so.
He knows it. Cathy, who are you?
I am Cathy McDonald. I am the audit supervisor for the real estate program.
And I can't tell you the number of times I call Cathy and say, hey, what about this? What would you say to this question? So thank you both for being here. I have heard from some designated brokers recently that there have been audit findings. This was a new one for me, so help me understand what this is all about. The designated broker says that their auditor found a problem with respect to purchase and sale agreements, missing signatures, missing pieces, something along those lines. What are we talking about?
I would say probably what we're talking about is we've probably got like a purchase and sale agreement or addendums that are either missing signatures or missing initials on one of the pages of the contract or one of the addendums. So it's not complete. So there is not like a full paper trail of every single document that needs to be signed being signed. And we know that transaction, most of the time we look at closed files, sometimes we look at pending files, but we know that transaction has closed. So we know that those complete documents exist. So what the problem is with that is that now we know that there are documents that haven't been submitted to the firm. So it's missing documentation. So it's a record keeping issue.
All right. So you're not looking at this from, did the broker create an enforceable contract? You're looking at this from a record keeping.
Yeah, and we don't look at contracts from an enforceability standpoint. We don't look at them from that standpoint. We look at them from, it says it exists, so it should exist. Where is it?
Okay. So like, for example, you've got an optional clauses addendum, a Form 22D in a transaction that's closed, but the 22D you're looking at has only the buyer's initial and not the seller's initial. What you're saying is, the presumption is there is a 22D out there with the seller's initial. Why is it not in this transaction folder?
Correct.
Okay. A concern that came up in the same audit was that the settlement statement in the transaction folder did not appear to correlate to the transaction that closed. What's going on in that scenario?
Well, we can only speculate.
Well, before you speculate, is a settlement statement required to be retained in a firm's transaction folder?
Yeah, they're required to have closing documentation with their file, yes. So what I would think might have happened in the example you're giving would be, you see a purchase and sale agreement and it has, different names of buyers and sellers on it. Then they look at the closing statement and then the names of the buyer or seller, one or the other, would not be the same. So then the auditor at that point would then be looking for some type of an assignment contract that changed the name of the buyer, not typically going to be the seller, more than likely going to be the buyer. So if that's not there, then we've got a problem because we've either got, again, an incomplete contract. We're missing something. We can't follow the paper trail. There needs to be an audit trail. There is no audit trail in that file because we can't get from beginning to end and figure out what happened.
I get hotline questions about this often where buyers are trying to close a transaction and then the lender says, you're not qualified for financing on your own. You have to add another buyer, add a parent, somebody like that. And so what you're saying is in a scenario like that where additional buyers might get added on or there's even a wholesale change in buyers, that change in the party names has to be reflected through an assignment agreement or some documentation in the transaction folder.
Right, because it's changed the players.
Okay. That makes sense. And it's really important to state again that part of the requirement of a transaction folder is that closing documentation. That settlement statement has to be part of the transaction folder, right? Another concern is commission checks and who those commission checks are written to as they correlate to the transaction. Does that make sense?
It makes sense. I think we need to kind of remember, and for brokers need to remember, is the transactions and the compensation that the firm brought in is the property of the firm. So it should be written, if the closing agent is going to send a check to the firm, it's in the name of the firm.
Okay.
We do get a lot of questions that brokers, and actually designated brokers will bring to us as well. Can I pay my broker directly from the closing agent?
Right.
There's nothing that prohibits that from happening. However, the designated broker must make that decision on a case-by-case situation and give written instructions to that closing agent that once the firm's compensation is earned, and they have it, if they want to write that check, if I'm the designated broker and want to send that money directly to Annie Fitzsimmons broker, that's great. There should be some documentation, both with that closing agent and also with the transaction file. We hesitate and we say you should use great caution to say, I'm going to send out a blanket to every closing agent and the entire state that all my brokers get paid directly. It should be on a case-by-case situation for what that situation is.
Okay.
That happens. We see it come up quite a bit when a broker leaves a firm or they've retired. They're not going to bring it back into the firm to send it back out. It can go directly to that broker.
But again, there should be written instruction in
Yes.
that transaction folder, signed by the designated broker, instructing the escrow officer to pay that broker or that broker who was licensed to the firm at the time the commission was earned
Yes.
directly.
Yes.
Yeah, and we will look for that in an audit. If we see a licensee being paid directly from escrow or directly from an attorney's office or whatever the case may be, whoever handled the closing, immediately my auditor will go look and see, okay, where's the written instruction from the designated broker to have this happen?
Okay, and it needs to be specific to that transaction. I do have brokers say, so I have a listing broker in my office who represents a seller, who represents a builder or developer in a plat. They're closing transactions all the time for this developer. It's always the same escrow officer closing the transactions. And it would be so much more efficient to send a cover letter saying, always pay this broker from this seller's transactions directly. That's not good enough.
They're taking on a tremendous lot of responsibility and liability under the statute and law. It belongs to the firm.
Okay.
That's what we will tell them. We know it's probably not great to do that. It would make it easier in your scenario, but we would like to see for an individual transaction, case-by-case situation.
Closing date and required extensions. Transaction closes. It was the original purchase and sale agreement says that the closing date is going to be July 1st. It closes on July 15th. What do your auditors expect to see in that transaction folder?
They do expect to see extensions. They expect that it meets the timelines of the contract. So the terms of the contract have changed. So they just follow it from beginning to end. So if it closed on a certain date, they do look for a closing date extension in any form. It can be an initial change of date on the face of the purchase and sale agreement. It can be an addendum. It can be whatever. We don't dictate what it looks like, but they do expect to see that the contract was still valid.
What if the original closing date is July 1st and it closes on June 28th? Is that okay?
We don't get into the contractual little terminology of it. We would only look at it if it looked like they didn't have a valid contract. We're not going to go backwards and go, oh wait, but it closed a couple days early. Did everybody agree to close a couple days early? Not likely.
That's not your concern.
Yeah.
Your
No.
concern is if it closes after the
Yeah.
identified closing date.
Yeah.
And,
Okay.
and are the parties aware of what's happening? That's what we're looking for in those audits. What's documenting that the parties know that this thing is going to close, this transaction is going to close 10 days later.
So I'm hearing all of this explanation, and I got to say, some of this stuff seems kind of picky.
I agree. It probably does. But what we're really looking at is what is transparent for the consumer. If our auditor can't follow it from beginning to end and know what is happening, then the consumer certainly cannot. And that's really what we're looking for, is for the transparency and the protection of the consumer so they know what's happening and they understand it and it's clear.
Okay, well, that That makes sense. So the consumer can understand it. And then also on top of that, so your auditor has all of the records in front of them to know that the consumer had a clear picture of what was happening.
Correct.
Okay. So picky, but for the protection of consumers. If you have questions on this topic or any other, ask me a question by visiting warealtor.org. Thank you for being a Washington Realtors member.